Hello everyone, this is Torrey with Team GC, and I'm here today to do a deck profile for my two decks that I brought to the North American Continentals / Nationals recently, a few weekends back. So for those of you who aren't in the know, I was the winner. I won the event, and I am just really excited and honored to be representing North America at the World Championship this year. The event was awesome. It was so great seeing everyone, and it was so cool being able to meet Kageyama-san for the first time. So moving on to the event, the two decks that I ran were Earth, Water, Monsters, and Magissa. So we were running the Girl Power duo of Realm and Gissa, and both decks did extremely well on the weekend. So the first deck I'm going to talk about is Magissa, because I have a lot less words to say. And the first question is, why run Magissa, right? So why did I choose these two decks? And Magissa is complicated. Not only is my reasoning complicated for bringing it, the deck itself is extremely complicated, and I love that. As a monster player, I love difficult, complicated decks. I love these cool, fast combo decks. My Water Fire monster deck actually plays surprisingly extremely similarly to Magissa, where it's a combo deck where you spend like 1 or 2 turns building resources, and then you just like slam everything on the board and play a bajillion cards and kill someone. So I love decks like that. I love being able to search my deck and grab whatever I need whenever I need it. So yeah, just the deck was fun to play, and it exactly fit my playstyle. Importantly, it was basically all in one color. Only one card in the deck was not fire, and that was Mog. So that made Magissa very flexible with my other decks. So by picking Magissa as my second deck, it allowed me to take my time and figure out what the optimal non-fire monster deck was, right? I could run Water Earth, I could run Mono Water, I could run Water Lightning, I could run Water Wind, right? Water Ice. Every single option that did not include fire was available. And even though Water Fire and Water Earth Fire are my favorite monster decks, I knew that there were other options and that I'd be able to find something playable. Moreover, because it just has really good matchups in the current format, so the only real losing matchup Magissa has right now is Mono Water. You don't want to play against Mono Water, but everything else is definitely doable. Everything else you go pretty much at least even with, including Mono Earth, which is just a really great place to be. In fact, I'm starting to think that Magissa might actually be slightly positive in Mono Earth. I'm not positive about that, so don't quote me on that, but I think it's definitely possible that Magissa is able to just go under Mono Earth efficiently. So yeah, the last thing is, because Magissa is so fun, not to sound arrogant, but I was planning on making it to the finals. I was planning on doing well. And under the assumption that I'm going to be playing this deck all day, I needed the deck to be fun. Like, otherwise, I'm going to start making mistakes because I just don't want to be playing the deck. So, for instance, in testing, when I was helping test Mono Earth with my teammates, I was like, after one game of Mono Earth, I was like, guys, I can't do this anymore, right? Like, this deck bores me to death. Like, after just one game, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I cannot do this. I cannot go on. Whereas Magissa, every game was fun and exciting, and you just got to play all your cards. So it's just great. So here is the 50 that I brought to Nationals. And for the keen-eyed watchers, you might notice some similarities. Some things might be, ringing some bells. And that's because I'm a thief. This list is almost card for card stolen from William Lowe's list from the Raleigh Materia Cup. So because I was planning on spending all of my time working on and building monsters, I did not have tons of time to build Magissa from scratch. And people have already cooked Magissa, right? Why waste time and effort building this deck that I'm not an expert on? So if you go back and look at the list, there's 2 major changes I made. There's a LB change, but I don't think that's relevant. The 2 main changes I made to the deck were I cut Felthanos and the Yamano Ifrit for Zande and Mog, and I think those changes were extremely positive for the meta we are in. Mog is insane and should probably have been a Magissa from the moment Tyvis was printed. This card is just crazy, in the current format. It's just crazy in general. I love this card, and it's pretty much what I always grab off the first Tyvis. It's just so good. The second change of the Zonde was just because I really like playing backups in this deck, and I just wanted more backups to play. And the Amano Ifrit, while it does help you against board clears by buffing up all your guys but plus 2k, that wasn't really relevant because Heck 5 isn't being played in the current Mono Earth lists for the most part. I believe there's only one Heck 5 in all of Top Cut. I'll have to go back and check, but I think it was just one. I think Sam was the only one that had it. So because Heck 5 isn't seeing play, and Mono Earth is relying on Genova Synthesis, and Genova Synthesis is an ability, not a summon, which means Yuzuki negates it. So we're like, once Yuzuki's on board, you're pretty much just safe from Mono Earth. Their only real out is committing like a hard board clear, like Shadow Lord or Shantotto or whatnot, outside of like using Titan to kill Yuzuki, but then they need to like pair like Genova with Titan, and it starts like getting more complicated and harder. And like maybe you can even play another Yuzuki afterwards off of Magissa during your opponent's turn. So there's lots of, you have the technology, right? You don't need the Ifrit. Now, if the Mono Earth players start respecting Magissa again and start putting Heck 5 backs in their deck, you will need to put the Mono Ifrit back in. But as it stands right now, I think that we can just keep it like this. So that's about all I have to say about Magissa. So let's move on to the monsters. So the first question is, why did I choose to bring monsters to the event? And I think most people watching this already know why I brought monsters. So the real question is, why did I bring Earth Water monsters? You know, let's specifically the Earth. Why is there Earth on the deck? At this point, monsters are more or less intrinsically tied to the water element. Realm is the best monster support card in the game, and Witch is amazing, Gal's amazing, Blue Worm's great. So like, obviously we're gonna be in water. So why Earth? And the answer is mostly Mira. Mira is just an amazing tool in the current format when paired with Witch. Realm pulls all the monsters out of your deck, Witch then sacrifices the monsters, and then Mira brings them back. Against aggro, Mira comes in, gives you tons of bodies for extremely cheap, and punishes the early aggression by making them wish that they hadn't given you any damage. And against the slow control decks, Mira comes in and helps Witch finish off all those big 8Ks, 9Ks, and 10Ks. Earth also lets us toolbox into any element we want because of cards like Tyro and Shantotto, and cards like Mira letting us ignore the elements on monsters. So because Earth lets us grab whatever best cards from whatever elements we really need to fix our bad matchups, running Earth as your secondary element is kind of like running every element as your secondary element. It's just really great in that way. So here's the list. And for those of you who love running 3-ofs in your deck, I am sorry. I'll get into it later. There is a reason why there's only 4 playsets in this deck. And the math is complicated, but it's like this for a reason. It was not an accident. This is not the result of not spending enough time limiting my options down to only the best cards. There is a method to my madness. So there's a lot to go over here. I'm going to be touching on every single card in the deck. And so let's get started. So first of all, like I mentioned earlier, what are these ratios? There's 18 different sets of 1-ofs, only 4 playsets. We've got 2 Realm, only a couple searchers for her, really running 1 Atomo, so if we draw it, Realm can't play it. Lots of off-color cards, lots of monsters are off-color. We're going to get into all of this. So, the consistency paradox. So as we all know, running max copies of a card is optimal because the more copies you run, the more likely you are to see them, the more consistent your deck is. But that isn't necessarily true. So specifically with backups, especially, if you run lots of Sarah, right, you're more likely to find Sarah, which is good. Sarah's a good card. But we're also more likely to find multiple copies of Sarah. And if we're only want to run a couple backups in our deck, like we want to run as few backups as possible, because the fewer backups you run, the more room you have for actual cards that do things, right? So you want to run as few backups as possible. And Sarah helps you with that, right? Because Sarah represents 2 backups. However, Sarah also hurts you with that, because if you draw 2 Sarah, it's kind of like you only drew 1 backup instead of drawing 2. And you want every single backup you draw to be live. So that's why, in order to make sure that every single backup I drew was live, for the most part, I ran as few backups, named backups, as possible, and with only like basically 2 exceptions. And we'll get into those 2 exceptions and why those ones are worth running at multiple copies. So additionally, by running fewer copies of any given card, we have more room for a variety of effects. So because we have so many consistency tools, like even though I'm only running 2 copies of Realm, I'm running a bunch of cards that still search Realm. We're not running every card that searches Realm, but we have enough copies of Realm and enough cards that search Realm that we're going to find Realm eventually. And unlike decks like my Water Fire monster deck, this deck is not like a combo aggro deck, right? This is a combo control deck. Like, we have time. We don't need to slam a turn 2 Realm every game. We don't even need to slam a turn 3 Realm every game. We can be just fine playing Realm on like turn 4. Like, the rest of the deck has enough tools that while Realm is the best card in the deck, like, we can survive without her. At least for enough time. So, by cutting copies of everything, we have more room for more stuff. And because everything, basically every card in the deck can be searched, we can grab whatever stuff we need for any given matchup and play it. Also, because we're in Earth, we have the ability to recur all these cards, so we can, by running more different copies, we have more different options that we bring back and keep using over and over and over again. So right, so even though we only have 1 copy of Buffasaur, for instance, we have the ability to play that Buffasaur 2, 3, 4, 5, infinite times per game until it kills us. So like, even though we only have the 1 copy, we can search it out when needed, and we can recur it to keep using it in the matchups where it's good. Right? So that 1 copy goes a long way. So moving on, let's start talking about our forwards. There's only 12 forwards in the deck, and all of these were vital to my victory for the most part. So obviously, we got to start with the GOAT. We got Realm. She's arguably the best forward of the game. She's broken. She's amazing. I love this card. Hobby Japan, please don't touch her. She's so good. I'm not going to go into all the math of why she's so good, but just trust me when I say that her effect is bare minimum, her ETB is bare minimum worth 7 CP, and on the high end can be valued as high as around 9. She's an incredibly strong, powerful card. Her end of turn effect is also good. It does come up. It lets you just snipe LBs off of the board for free in the mid game. She's just overall amazing, and if this card didn't exist, monsters would just not be a thing. Next, we have Mira. So I talked a bunch earlier about why Mira's good, but she just does everything. Also, I didn't mention this earlier, she's a really good Lena target. But yeah, Mira, she fixes math, she gives us more value in the long game, and just helps us stabilize the board against aggro. Just incredible card, and is basically the whole reason we're in Earth. Next is Witch of the Fence. Also an amazing Lena target, and just, this card is so pushed. I still cannot believe that they printed this card. Like, why does this exist? Why does she shrink instead of deal damage? I understand that dealing damage is not in, like, Water's part of the color pie, but minus 7k shrink? Like, once Witch hits the board, like, you win every combat ever, basically, right? Because, like, you can just attack with Realm, and, like, what's gonna happen? Your opponent gonna block? Right? They block, you just shrink them. Even if they have a 9k, Realm wins. Right? They have a 10k, Realm wins. I just do not understand this card. Just an absolutely ludicrous piece of cardboard. Also, as mentioned earlier, synergizes really well with Mira, with getting the 9k instead of just the 7. Next is Lark. So, we're running 2 Mira, 1 Larkagus. Originally, I was running 3 Mira, but even though Larkagus is worse than Mira, there is a reason to run 1 copy of him over the 3rd Mira. And the reasons are, A, he's damage agnostic, so like, even if your opponent refuses to hit you, Larkagus is always live. Which is valuable against decks like Mono Earth. So like, let's say you like had to discard your first Buffasaur against Mono Earth, right? And they are refusing to hit you. You could then either Lena out Larkagus or use Tyro to play Larkagus to then get that Buffasaur out, and then that gets you your first point of damage, and then now your mirrors are live. So the A, that's good. But B, sometimes once Mira hits the board, your opponent will like refuse to kill her, which can be awkward if you need to get a monster back out of your break zone. So having another copy of one of your copies of Mira not be named Mira is really important. Because, like, for instance, against Ryan Chen on stream, I played Mira targeting Atomos after he used Chilinka to kill Atomos the previous turn, and he used Y'shtola to cancel my Mira, at which point I lena specialed out Larkakis to then grab the Atomos anyway. Right, if the Larkakis was just the third copy of Mira, you wouldn't be able to do that play because I had Mira on board. So, what was actually great about that play was because lena special isn't a cast. I was still on cast 1, which meant I was able to play a card and trigger Atomos that turn. It was quite good. So yeah, that's why Larkakis is in here, and it's part of also what I mentioned earlier about how running fewer copies of cards but running more cards actually increases your consistency and increases the ceiling of your deck. It's if Larkakis was just the third copy of Mira, the deck would have been worse, despite Larkakis in general being like Mira at home, being worse Mira. Next we have Sophie. Oh, Sophie. What a nice girl. So Sophie's just a solid card. One of the issues with the deck is since we only have 12 forwards, actually finishing games before we deck ourselves can be difficult, and Sophie makes that less of a problem. Getting her to 10k is pretty trivial in this deck, right? Because let's say you have like cards like Gal represents 2 different forwards, so like that triggers Sophie almost by himself. Leo and Mott are pretty easy LBs to get on the board at like any time you need them, so that's an extra 2k. Blue Worms you can animate. Like it's really easy to get Sophie to 10k. So like when you're head on board, you can just slam Sophie down for like really cheap and let you just ping your opponent without like overcommitting to the board. You can like hold up a bunch of resources in hand, right? Like once you're head on board, you don't want to like keep overcommit because this deck gets absolutely demolished by Shantotto LB and Ned. And like because we have so few forwards, we can't afford to just jam everything and lose everything because then we're probably gonna lose the deck out before we can recommit and build a new board. So Sophie's just a nice way to help get a bit of damage in. Y'shtola, I love this card. Oh, also one other thing about Sophie is that if you lena her out, even though she's dull, she still can hit your opponent, right? So she's a really good lena target for finishing the game. So back to Y'shtola. So this card is so good. So like, there's a reason why Ryan Chen was running Y'shtola in his Mono Earth deck. That's because this card is really good versus Mono Earth. As long as she's not dull, which as long as you don't attack with her, she won't be dull. Mono Earth has no way to kill her outside of board clears, right? Like all of their cheat removal is damage based, which she ignores. So unless your opponent commits like a Shantotto or a Neo X Death or a Shadow Lord or whatnot, Y'shtola is going to live. But the thing is, those effects are the effects that Y'shtola wants to cancel anyway. That's what she's here for. So realistically, she's like extra copies of Levy and Mist Dragon, right, for canceling summons or auto abilities respectively. But she's one that we can recur even easier, right? Because we can lena her out on our opponent's turn. Also, because she's wind, she makes it just a slightly bit easier for us to cast Atomos. Twice over the course of the tournament, actually, I pitched Y'shtola to cast Atomos. Neither of my opponents were prepared for that, and both of them were extremely caught off guard, and then got blown out by Atomos. So yeah, she's just really nice in the current format, and she's just solid, just very good. I definitely used her a bunch, and she is often just a nail in the coffin. The one copy of Gal. So because monsters have this awkward issue where Realm is extremely powerful, but in order to justify running Realm, you need to run a lot of monsters in your deck. And a lot of the monsters don't do anything other than draw a card. And while drawing cards is good, they don't represent the other tools you need to win the game, right? Like you need slots for removing things, slots for killing your opponent, and card draw doesn't do those things. It just makes you find the other things that you've slotted easier. So because so much of your deck space is quote-unquote wasted on cards that don't actually do anything, monster decks can have issues fitting all of the different tools they need. That's also part of the reason why I wanted to run a bunch of one-ups, is to fit more options in the deck. And Gal does the most amount of things in the least amount of space, right? So Gal gives us forward removal, right? He bottom decks basically whatever we want. He also is the only form of monster removal on the deck, right? So he can target an opponent's monster and turn it into an 8k, and then we can like Witch Mira, shoot it for 9k, and it's gone, right? He's also really good for boosting our forward counts for cards like Tidus to hit the 8 we need for Tidus, or for Sophie to get the 3 we need for Sophie. He gives us reach, right? Because like we can, if we have an Opalo on board that can't attack, we can play Gal, bottom deck it forward, and then attack with Opalo and get a point of damage we wouldn't be able to get it otherwise. He just does everything. Gal is so good. I love this card. Even though he's amazing though, you don't only need the run. You only need the one. He's just solid. I feel like there was something else, but it's fine. Next is Une. Last forward. And Une is really funny in this deck. Une with Haste Goblin just catches people off guard every time. No one expects you to be able to haste Une, grab back a summon, and then cast a summon on that turn. So they'll like target Une with an effect that will kill her, and then you can either grab back Misdragon if it's a summon, or cancel Levy if it's an auto ability, and just say, no, Une's gonna live. And once Une lives a single turn, she starts snowballing out of control. Because now every turn, she's grabbing back summons to protect herself, or to recur herself, and all sorts of goodies. And, oh yeah, also, Une and Gal, both of these cards synergize really well with Mata LB, because you can attack with them and still hold up their effects. So like with Gal, like playing Mott when Gal's on board, it's kind of like playing a haster, right? Because you can attack with Gal and then use Gal's effect after he attacks to get an additional attacker. So playing Mott like gives you an extra point of damage. Similarly, playing Mott when you have Une on board gives you the ability to deal a point of damage and still grab back a summon afterwards, which is really, really nice. And it's kind of like you get a 2CP discount on your Mott. Very solid. I didn't cast Une much on day 2, but she was powerful on day 1. It just depends on the board states. She's really good at removing LB cards, for instance, but just on day 2, my opponents were in positions where giving them cards back to their hand would have just made it easier for them to like Shantotto LB. Moving on, let's talk about the monsters. There's, I believe, 11 monsters in the deck, and all of them were running 1 copy of each, except for Blue Worm. Every monster is in fire, wind, or water. Despite this being a water-earth deck, there are no earth monsters in the deck. So let's start going through the monsters one by one, starting with, of course, Atmos. So Atmos is the best green card in the game. I think I can say that pretty conclusively now. And it's basically the whole reason why Realm is good. Like, having water just should not have access to this type of effect. And if Atmos was just a 2CP water card, this card would have been banned, right? I can't imagine just any blue deck being able to play this for free. You really want to run 2, because if you draw it, you can't Atmos it from deck, and it's really hard to cast, outside of, like pitching Yola, like I mentioned earlier. But chances are we're not going to draw it and Evray, and if Realm gets Evray out, it's still not like the end of the world, right? Because you can, instead of going Atmos plus like Opalo, you could do like Evray plus Blue Worm, and it's like fine. It's like kind of the same thing. Also, like even if we draw the Atmos, we have multiple ways of getting it onto the board. So like the water fire decks, basically the only way to get Atmos on the board is off of Realm. It's either Realm or pitch Atmos or Atmos. But because we have cards like Lark and Mira to play the Atmos from Break Zone, or cards like Shantotto and Tyro that color fix for win CP, we can actually play it or get it on board if we draw it. So that's why I went with only 1. I don't think running only 1 copy ever caused any issues. I was never punished for it. In other elements, like water fire or water ice or water lightning or whatnot, I would still probably run the 2 Atmos, because you don't have access to that same breaks and recursion and color fixing that Earth has access to. But because we're in Earth, we can get away with being greedy and running only 1. Next, we have Baby Atmos in Evray. This card's fine. The main reason it's in here is that number in the top left corner is a 1. I'm actually not big of a fan of Evray, as I am of a bunch of the other monsters, but it does its job. It's okay. Specifically, if that 1 CP matters that turn, like you're playing an odd costed card, then this card has the same immediate card advantage as Opalo, right? And in that case, it's better. But if the CP on Evray is being wasted that turn, I'd rather usually go for the Opalo off of Realm and just see more cards. Because also, like, if we draw Evray later in the game, we can still get it onto the board with either Mira or Lark or Tyro or Shantotto, right? So it's not the end of the world if we hard draw this later. Like, we don't have to play this off of Realm. The big reason why I don't play Evray in my non-Water Earth decks is because we don't have ways to play it except off of the Realm. And since the first Realm is basically always getting Goblin in a lot of those decks, there's never a time where we would actually grab this, so it's just a dead card. Moving on to the water monsters, we've got 3 copies of the boy. Blue Worm is just so good. I'm starting to think that maybe Blue Worm is not okay and should maybe not be long for this world. We have alternatives too, so it's not like water decks would die if we lost Blue Worm, but I don't know, this card is starting to feel extremely overtuned to me. But yeah, Blue Worm is how we get those points of damage in. He's just very, very, very good. This card is just insane. He does everything. Importantly, he's really good at triggering Atomos because he's more or less a free cast. But he's also good after Atomos to use up that 2 CP that Atomos generates. Just everything about this card is crazy in this deck, and running less than 3 would be a mistake. Next is we have our 4th copy of Blue Worm. So there will occasionally be turns where you're like realming for every Blue Worm or whatnot, or you need to like Mira for like a Blue Worm or an Echidna, and there's a card in your hand that you do not have the CP to cast. So you really want your Blue Worm to draw into a specific element, and in those cases, I often go for Echidna instead, to just grab that specific element from my break zone. So that way I can guarantee cast the card and I'm not gambling on the top card of my deck being a specific element. But also this card just lets you recur our important summons like Mist Dragon and Levi Tarasu. Importantly, over Blue Worm, if you have summons in your hand that are dead cards, you can convert them into points of damage without losing card advantage. So Echidna can hit your opponent multiple times, which is nice. But in general, I barely attacked with this card. It was mostly just grab back a summon, sack for Witch, which is like good enough. In the old monster decks, I wouldn't run Echidna because I would never attack with it. And if I'm not attacking with it, why is it in my deck? But now that we have the alternative value out of Witch, the adding back of a summon becomes a lot more valuable. Okay, next is Little Blue Worm. So Piranha is in here because I wanted Realm to be able to summon a forward in the 1-cost slot. And looking through our options, Piranha was the best one. It's also in here as it's like a vestigial card where its goal was to help Witch hit thresholds in non-Earth monster decks, right? Like if there's a 9k on board and like I didn't have Hippocampus, you could like summon Piranha, shrink it, and then like sack a monster to kill like a 9k, which is like good, but I think Mira does it better most of the time. I don't know, Piranha was just kind of mid all weekend. It's like good, but like you can't cut any of the 1-cost monsters, right? Because we only have 4. And going down to 3 is too few. Like, Realm will start whiffing. Even the first Realm will start whiffing at that point. So you need 4. There were so many times over the course of the tournament where, like, even for my first Realm, there was only one monster left on the deck. So yeah, it's tight. The numbers are very tight. I could see replacing this with Quadov, just to kill things like Leo or the disciplinary members in the Chaos deck. But Piranha did its job. It was fine. It's fine. It's good. But it was never an all-star. So if you decide to play this deck, you could cut it and I wouldn't be upset with you. The other 1-cost monster, the final one, is Opalo. I mean, this card says exactly what he does. He draws a card. He's like bad Blue Worm a lot of the time, but the fact that he costs 1 means that you can pair him with an Atomos off of your Realm, which is really important because he's kind of like how instead of going for Realm plus Search Goblin, Realm for Atomos plus Search Goblin, you can do Realm for Atomos plus Opalo. And that's like the same card advantage. And while Search Goblin is a search and gets you the exact backup you want, and like also has the ability to be like crack itself for 3k, Like, just because this is a bad version of Search Goblin, that's fine. Search Goblin is broken. Like, being a bad version of a broken card is still often a really good card. And Opalo is just really good. It just fits a lot of holes in the deck, and you can't really cut it. It's also, you could run a second Opalo over the Piranha as well. That would be fine. But yeah, this thing does everything it needs to do, and is necessary for the deck to function. Oh no, there is one more one-cost monster. Oh yes, it's the boy! It's the boy! Oh my god, I love Goblin. Oh, this is my favorite card in the deck. Oh, I messed up so many lethal lines with this card. People never expect the Water Earth deck to haste you 3 times in one turn and kill you out of nowhere. They just never see it coming. They never see it coming. It's so funny every time it happens. So yeah, the main reason this is in the deck is for reach. The deck has trouble killing people, so being able to like bring out guys and kill your opponent out of nowhere is really important. But also, it has really good synergy with Une and Atmos. As I mentioned earlier, it lets you grab back summons the turn Une comes down, which makes it much more likely that Une survives the turn and can grab back more summons. But also, there was multiple times in the tournament where I was able to play Atmos and then immediately hasten him in with Goblin to activate all my backups, which is just crazy value. So good. This card's so fun. Yeah. Next up is Bomb. This card kills Laswell. Okay. For the final monster, we have my next favorite monster in the deck, possibly, and that's Buffasaur. Oh, Buffasaur also gets the people going. People love this card. I don't think anyone expected me to bring Buffasaur this weekend, or that weekend. I talked to a few people in the community about my love for this card before, but I'm going to talk about it now. So, Buffasaur is in the deck because he solves similar to Gao, he solves the most amount of problems in the least amount of deck space. So like I mentioned earlier, sometimes the control decks just will not hit you, and it's frustrating. And you just really need that first point of damage from Mira to come online and start beating people up. So, playing Buffasaur, killing something, and getting to damage 1 is just extremely solid in this deck. But the thing is, that's not all that Buffasaur does. Buffasaur is also just really good versus Mono Earth, because when your opponent goes for their Leo wall play, Leo entering the board now creates a stack. And either you can A, use Buffasaur to kill the Leo, or if you have like Witch on board, right, in response to the Buffasaur trigger, you can sacrifice a different monster to kill the Leo and keep the Buffasaur in round. That way if they play another Leo, Buffasaur's still around and can kill that one instead. So just, this card does so much. Like, being able to fix your damage is so important in decks running cards like Mirror and Atmos. And being able to punish Leo and prevent Leo wall from coming down is so important. I don't think a single Mono Earth player was actually able to Leo wall me the whole time. And that's because of cards like Buffasaur coming in and saying, don't you think about it, don't you dare. It's so funny. I love this card. He's so good. In the future, he might also be really good against the priming forwards that are coming out in the next set, because priming can only happen at sorcery speed, and since now those forwards enter and create a stack, you can Buffasaur them before they can prime into the icons. Oh, this card is so funny. I love it. I love any card that basically changes the fundamental rules of how the game works. And Buffasaur, for being this weird rare from Opus 19, just does so much. It's so funny. It never gets old. Every time Buffasaur triggers, an angel gets its wings. Oh, this card's great. Okay, so then that was all the monsters, and as you might have noticed, where's the Earth monsters? Hobby Japan, please. Can we get better Earth monsters? There's like a couple okay ones, but the fact that none of them are as good as Buffasaur, I think, really says a lot. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about the summons. So, these cards are pretty standard in the current format. I'm not going to go through each one of them, other than just saying Cancel Levy is like the best card. But you gotta run EX Burst for Chaos. You gotta run Mist Dragon and Leviathan and Kusith if you want to win long games. Moving on, let's talk about the backups. So like I mentioned earlier, you really only want to run one copy of each named backup if you can, because you want to ramp your backups as consistently as possible, and drawing multiple copies of a same name backup is just dead cards, and it like artificially reduces the number of backups in your deck, kind of, when it comes to ramping out. So that's why you see all these one-ups. The backups all did great on the weekend, and the two that I'm running at lots of multiples, I have very good reasons for it, and we'll get into that when we get to them. So we're going to go through each one at a time. So first, we have Animist. He's our Earth Luso target. What's especially nice about him as an Earth Luso target is that because we can search him at any time we want from the LB deck, we can access him the moment we get to damage 3 to then search any monster we want out of our deck, which is really nice. He's also an alternate way to get any monster we need from our deck, because every monster in the deck costs 2 or less, at instant speed, and at any color. So if we need Bomb to come in and blast the Laswell off in response to like a Laswell trigger on our opponent's turn, we can do it. If we need to be able to haste our Atomosin the turn that we played our Atomos, you can do that as well. I did that against Mike Powell. He was not expecting me to mirror out Atomos from the break zone and then crack Animist, summon Goblin from deck. That was not a line that he thought was probably possible in my Water Earth deck. This card is just really nice. It's a lot of fun. I love it. It just does so much for us. And I'm glad that Luso gives us an excuse to actually run it, because it's usually pretty hard to fit. Next we have Lerit. This is our Water Luso target. Lerit is cracked. I've gone on record multiple times saying that Lerit is broken. And I still believe it. This card is insane. It's so good. It does basically everything you want. It lets us put all those unplayable monsters back into our deck so Realm can pull them out. It lets us dig deeper into our deck. It's multi-playable. It only costs 3. This card could easily cost 4. It can crack itself, so even if we draw multiples, even if we have 5 backups on board, they're still not completely dead cards, because we can crack the one on the board to play another one. It's so good. This card does everything. I love it so much. Next we have Lena, and I could do a whole video on this card. So, Lena is one of the 2 backups that we're running at 3 copies, the other one being Tyro. And the funny thing about Lena is that while it is a named backup that you cannot run multiple copies of, this card actually increases the consistency of your deck at running multiple copies. So the math for that's complicated, so we'll start talking about the other reasons that we're running this card. First of all, the fact that this draws every time your opponent hits an EX burst is really stupid. It's so good. I love it so much. Punishing all those people for filling their decks with EX bursts gives me life. But anyway, the other reason why this deck is crazy is the special raise. So the first Lena you draw is a backup. However, the second Lena you draw and the third Lena you draw are effectively blank cards that represent any forward in your break zone. And as long as you have water CP, it can be even off-color forwards, like Lark or Yola. So by running 3 copies of Lena, not only are you adding 3 EX bursts to your deck, you're adding 3 backups to your deck, but also you're adding 2 forwards to your deck, right? So by adding 3 copies of Lena to your deck, you're giving yourself both access to more copies of backups for consistency finding a backup turn 1, but also you're running more copies of forwards to find consistency in playing threats every turn in the late game. So Lena, while cards like I said Gal provide slot compression because it does a lot of things in one slot, Lena does that to such an extreme that I'd say she actually gives the deck like slot expansion. Whereas this one card is effectively all the other cards in your deck. So by running her, you basically pseudo increase the amount of different cards into your deck, right? If you need extra summons, Lena can play Mira to grab back an Echidna to grab back whatever summon. Or she can just grab back Yola, who is a summon, more or less, right? If you need more forwards, she grabs back Mira, who's a great forward. If you need more monsters, you grab back Mira, grab back a monster. Or grab back Lark, grab back a monster. If you need more damage, you can grab back Sophie, deal a point of damage. She just does everything. This card's so good. But yeah, Lena just defines how this deck functions and is vital to your success. You will be Lena specialing multiple times per game. The fact that you can Lena out Mira grab back Echidna grab Kusith to then play the Kusith to grab back your Lena to do it again is so funny. I have Lena specialed so many times. This card just makes it so that the Congo line of assholes on your board just never stops. Anyway, moving on. Next, we have the rest of the Sarah gang. So we have Sarah, Epitaph, and Hilda. So we're running one of each, and Sarah can grab Epitaph, Hilda, or Lena. So if we already have Lena on board, playing Sarah to grab Lena is like 6 CP. Grab basically any forward from your breakstone, play it to the field, which is just like Eodolus, which is great. But it's a flexible Eodolus, right? Because you don't have to grab that Lena to grab it back. You can grab grab Epitaph and then search a mirror from your deck, or Larkakis from your deck. Or if you're damage 5, you can Sarah into Hilda and play Hilda, draw a card, and get that forward back, right? So all these cards are solid. None of these are necessary though. Like you could cut Sarah and just run the third copy of Loporrit. Like that wouldn't be terrible. Because chances are Loporrit's gonna find something good. Epitaph is also like not necessary, but Epitaph also kind of gives slot compression because it's a backup, but also it's a backup that guaranteed gets you one of your threats out of the deck and into your hand, which is really nice. It's also the only odd costed or 3 CP Earth backup in the deck, which is important. You could run a card like the 3 CP Rydia in one of these slots. It does a very similar job, but I think grabbing your forwards out of your deck is more important than getting the summons. It's hard to say. And Hilda is also replaceable, but we really just wanted to get as many EXs as we could for handling chaos. And the damage 5 effect is backbreaking for decks. Like if you can Hilda out a witch and then draw 2 cards is just crazy. It lets you really stabilize against those aggressive decks. Next is Merowyn. This card searches Realm. Okay. Next we have Tyro. So Tyro is the other backup that we're running at 3 copies. And that's, so because we're running 3 copies of Tyro, it does occasionally make us brick on drawing differently named backups. However, it's worth it because Tyro's color fixing increases the consistency of the deck more than Tyro causing us to brick on backups lowers it. So there is a lot of off-color cards in the deck, right? There's 3 wind cards, 3 fire cards, and 1 ice card, right? So there's 7 cards in the deck that can only be cast when a card like Tyro or Shantotto are on board, or if they're cheated into play via some other method. So Tyro's consistency boost also helps us find Realm early, is just that worth it. The EX Burst is also nice, and the Pump is also occasionally useful. Usually people aren't getting us to damage 5. I only lost to damage on this deck once the whole tournament. People aren't killing you. You're losing to deck out. You're decking yourself. So yeah, that's it for Tyro. The last 2 backups are our 2 board clears, Matoyo and Shantotto. We're running the 2 Shantotto and 1 Matoya because Shantotto's color fixing and being slightly cheaper I found more valuable than Matoya's flexibility. You could go 2-1 Matoya Shantotto instead of 1-2, but they're both just extremely good cards. I liked running both, partially because of what I was saying earlier with the name flexibility of being able to, like, if you draw Matoya early and like have to cast it as a regular backup, you can still Shantotto later. So that's nice. Also, some decks, it's the second board wipe that gets them. So being able to like Shantotto early on to wipe their first board, and then later cast Matoya to wipe their second board is sometimes just backbreaking for certain decks. Additionally, we're a monster deck, right? So you can Shantotto wipe their board and then attack with a Tomos, and then he activates all their backups. The fact that all of their monsters live and can get in for lethal is really nice following a board wipe. They're just good cards. I never actually cast Matoya for the board wipe, but I didn't play against much aggro on this deck, so I wasn't dealing with many boards. I did, however, use Matoya, and it was a vital part of my game plan. Also, just because I didn't use the board wipe with Matoya doesn't mean that Matoya didn't hold the board wipe over my opponent's heads, right? So there were hands where I was able to play out certain lines because I knew I had Matoya in hand and that I would be able to board wipe my opponent on the following turn. Except the following turn I just drew Shantotto, so I just used the Shantotto instead. But just because I drew Shantotto doesn't mean that Matoya threatening to do that to my opponent and being able to allow me to play around knowing I had the board wipe was... Matoya still did its job despite not being actually cast there, right? It's complicated. Finally, we have the LBs. I think these are all pretty self-explanatory. Uh, Mott, as I mentioned earlier, is really good for comboing with certain cards in their deck and allows us to push for lethal in times when we wouldn't normally be able to, or just to be able to start pressuring our opponent to follow up with a lethal on the following turn. Tidus is just a thug. This card is insane. Shantotto LB and Noctis, I actually never cast, I think, over the course of the event. Shantotto, because as I mentioned, I didn't play much aggro, and usually I was the one, like, pressuring my opponent, not the other way around, despite this being a control deck, funnily enough. With Noctis, I just didn't, because of how my hands were, I was usually going for Leo plus Tidus plus another one cost, like Luso or Mott, and Noctis costing LB2 was a little too expensive most of the time. But I was still glad I had Noctis, because having Noctis still forces your opponent to play around the fact that you can grab back any forward anytime you might need it, right? So his existence was still powerful, even if I never played him. Similar with Lunafreya, I only cast her a couple times. Usually when I completely bricked on backups on turn 1. Twice in the tournament, I had to play a turn 1 Lunafreya because I had no backups in hand. And both times I was lucky to hit Lena off of the Lunafreya, so I could then draw an additional card and then play the Lena. And it was basically like Lunafreya cost only 1 card from hand, which was worth it. Luso, you never want to cast Luso. I only did it a couple times, and every time I did it, I was like, gosh, I wish this was a Leo, but I really need a backup right now. Luso is fine, but I think he's better in decks that don't have Leo access. But he did his job, and he searched me Loporits and Animists when I was really desperate for just getting another backup down. Okay, so I think that's it for the deck. We'll look at it one last time, bask in its glory. Oh, it's so beautiful. This deck was so fun to pilot, and I was so happy I was able to bring it home for it. Oh, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I love these ratios. I know a lot of people might think they're ugly ratios, but to me, this is so beautiful. This deck has basically every option you could possibly want, and because like half the cards in the deck draw cards, you're just constantly playing everything out every turn and just like churning through your whole deck, constantly having a full grip to threaten summons on your opponent's turn. There's so much interaction, so much draw, so much recursion, so many options. You constantly have basically access to every card in your deck at all times, and the world is your oyster when you're playing this. It's so fun. I really recommend trying something like this out to most people that play Final Fantasy. Like, once you get used to this style of deck, like, you can't go back. Okay, so anyway, that's it for today. It was so fun being at Nats. These are all my boys that went. We had a great time. That's me and Sam in the middle. We're going to be going to Worlds. Hopefully I'll see a bunch of you people there. And that's it. Peace, and thanks for watching.